We hear this language that sounds contradictory to us, what Jesus says in here. He is praising these negative things. He's praising things that seem kind of negative to us, such as those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who are weeping, and those who are hated. These are things that, of course, when he says this, he doesn't strictly only mean a physical hunger. He really means a true hunger, a spiritual hunger, a hunger more for God, a hunger for justice, for truth to prevail in the world. That is the truth that comes from Christ. He's speaking of these things in relation to our faith, not just by the very fact of being poor. Somebody's not going to go to heaven just because they're poor. Just because they're materially poor in this world does not mean they're going to go to heaven as a direct correlation, or being hungry, or being mournful, or being hated. Those are not things that get us to heaven. Rather, as these things are done in Christ and out of love for Jesus Christ, then they can help us to get us holier, to bring us closer to Christ, and then, God willing, be brought into heaven. So when he says these, obviously these are from the Beatitudes, but that's not the complete list of the Beatitudes, as this is in Luke's Gospel that we're reading today. And so only a few of them are focused on, or are recounted by St. Luke. All of these things that are being poor in spirit, recognizing that you need God, and that without Him you can't do anything. Without His grace, you cannot do anything. You can't become holy without the grace of Christ. You can't merely work on your own to do it. You do need to work in the sense of you need to cooperate with God's grace, because He needs our freedom. He needs our free yes to Him to do so. But being poor in spirit is a recognition of how much we need God. Just as He gives the opposite of that. Those who are rich are those who don't think they need God. They don't recognize their need for the support and the providence of God the Father. And so it's true for Him to say, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." They are already consoled. They don't feel any need to be consoled or to be upheld by God. So yes, they have already received their consolation, because all they're focused on is their material ability to keep themselves comfortable and to not recognize their need for God. They're not in this position because merely they have wealth, but because they do not recognize that it comes from God and that they need His help to do anything in this world that is good. And those who are filled, they don't feel a hunger for God. They don't feel a hunger for more of His presence, for more holiness, for His justice, and for truth to reign in the world. That's a hunger that is seen with a lot of people now, because of there's always been bad things happening in the world, of course, but partially because we know more about it because of the news, and also partially because it's a time when the Christian world, a lot of it has turned away from God. So there is more evil happening. It has more reign because of that. Those things really make us want to see justice. We don't want to see those who do evil things triumph. We want to see them get their just deserts. We want to shy away from revenge, because revenge is never in accord with justice. But rather we want to give the judgment to God and ask Him to put people in their places that need to be put in their places. Not only because they're causing evil for others, but they're also endangering their own souls to go to hell. So that hunger for justice to be done, that's something we should desire and not be complacent and just think everything's okay. Those who laugh now can be seen as when he says, "Woe to those who laugh now," because they will grieve and weep. We need to grieve over our sinfulness. We need to grieve that we are sinners. Not become depressed. That's not what that means. Grieving is not depression. Rather, it's grieving that I'm a sinful person. That I long for a time when I do not sin anymore, when I cannot sin anymore, which in heaven you cannot sin anymore. Woe to you when all speak well of you. Now this one we can probably understand a little more because we see very often, not just with politicians, but a lot of other well-known figures, or even people we know who are kind of charming, but they don't really have a lot of good that they're bringing about. They just kind of make people happy on the surface, and those people are not in a good position because most likely they're not being authentic, meaning they're not as likely to be living in the truth, because the false prophets were treated this way because they were false prophets. They just said what sounded good to people, what made people temporarily happy, not what would actually bring them full happiness, that is salvation. And thus, they were not in God's graces. So those who are spoken well of, a lot of people will say, if everyone likes you, there's something wrong. And that's kind of where that phrase comes from. It has to do with this, that if you're really authentic, it doesn't mean you have to be hated by everyone, but if you're really trying to live the gospel, you're going to rub some people the wrong way. And if you're trying to avoid rubbing them the wrong way, then there's a good chance all may like you because you're not really trying to do what is best for them. You're not trying to bring them the truth, but rather you're trying to avoid people disliking you. This is a problem a lot of priests have lived out in the last decades, where some of them have even said to people that they don't want people to dislike them. So they're not going to say this or that because they don't want to be disliked. That's a very pitiable position to be in because that tells you they're going to be held responsible by God for that. They know why they're doing it, because they don't want to be disliked. They want to be liked. They want to be loved by all, which is not the goal of a Christian. That's not the goal of a Catholic Christian. Our goal is to love others, but not that we're loved by all. That is not what happened to Jesus. He was not loved by all. He still is not loved by all. And if he was loved by all, he probably wouldn't be the Messiah. He wouldn't be the true God made man, not made man, but took on human flesh. So he, the God-man, would completely fulfill all of these things. He completely exemplifies what these Beatitudes are. He is a perfect example of them. He is perfect, but he grieves for sin on our behalf because he's the one who will take it on himself. So he truly grieved when he took on that sin. But he is in the absolute happiness of heaven. But he still desires us to be with him. He hasn't ceased to care about us because he's in heaven. He doesn't say, forget about you guys. I'm happy here and I don't care about what happens to you. He continually intercedes on our behalf to the Father as he is our mediator. And so Jesus, being the complete, perfect example of all of these things, wants us to recognize our need for the Father, wants us to hunger for justice, for truth to prevail in the world. He wants us to grieve over our sin so that we can fight those sins with his grace to be with him in heaven. And he wants us to truly love others, which doesn't mean that everyone will like us. Some people will, because they'll appreciate what you're trying to bring to them if it's something from God. He wants us, in other words, to be like him. to follow him.